Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the LitRPG podcast. I am Ramon Mejia. This is episode number 96 of the podcast. I'm here to bring you the latest LitRPG news, reviews, and of course author interviews. And this week I have 7 new LitRPG titles to review for you folks at home. And that's going to include the Clan Wars, Way of the Shaman Book 7. This is the last book in the Way of the Shaman series. It'll be a tearful goodbye, but some very interesting comments on it. Also out for review is going to be the 7th Talon, Book 1, Dragonrider Fury. Then also Respawn, Lives 1 through 5 by Arthur Stone, same author of the Weirdest Snoop series. Also Sicora Online, The Ringer. And then Eloria's Beginning, a LitRPG, GameLit Epic. And then after that, it'll be Rogue Online, The Devil's Gate. And then last, it's going to be The Grind. Okay, but of course we begin the show, though, with LitRPG news. And in LitRPG news, we're going to begin with to me, it's a very fun story. Jeffrey Falcon Logan, author of the Slime Dungeon Chronicles, is making a video game based on this story. It's very much in the development stages, but it's really fun and exciting to see somebody who's in our community, who's a writer, who makes a pretty good, wage on that. But then he's also expanding it beyond that into video games. Even this is a 2D side scroller, and you can tell it's very school project-ish, but it's still kind of fun to look at and see. And I'll pull it up for you guys to watch it, just kind of see it in the corner there. But definitely very interesting to look at. Let's see if I can pull it a little bit bigger. Maybe that's a little more useful. Maybe it isn't. I don't know. But still, very fun project. Definitely love looking at it. Makes me so happy for some reason to see a side scroller based on any LitRPG property. So there you go. Also, in some more fun stuff, just in the community, Charles Dean, he's a LitRPG author of The Way of Eternus, the Bathrobe Knight, and I forget the other series, but he has another one in the same Bathrobe Knight universe. He is trying to do a YouTube thing where he drinks and talks to authors he likes or just people he likes. It's called Drinking with Charles. And for his first episode, he had himself, he had Jeff Hayes, and he had Blaze Corvin. And they were all drinking very heavily and making some very fun statements and goofing around and talking about the genre and LitRPG author stuff and a bunch of other things. They all kind of got really drunk, and it was highly entertaining. I totally encourage you to go watch it and to laugh at it. The link in the show notes for the YouTube page. And for that particular one, it was done through Jeff Hayes' Sound Booth Theater YouTube page. But Charles Dean is also trying to just going to create his own YouTube channel for this specifically and for some of the other content he wishes to do. He also has another one, again, through Jeff Hayes' channel with Harmon Cooper. That just happened a little more recently, so definitely go check those out. But the one Blaze was very super, super funny. I can't recommend it enough to read, to watch, I should say. Okay, now this is an announcement from this podcast, actually. We don't do a lot of promotional things, but because our 100th episode is coming up and it's kind of a milestone for us, I decided to kind of throw a contest together to just kind of reward the viewers, reward the listeners, and create a little bit of promotion around the fact that we hit 100 episodes, or that we're going to hit 100 episodes. It's kind of exciting. We're doing this giveaway. Here are the ways that you can enter to win. You can actually do multiple entries, and you get basically more chances to win the prize, the fabulous prizes that I'll be giving out. You can ways to enter, basically sign up for our LitRPG podcast newsletter. I know you probably didn't know we had one. Most people don't. I basically just send out the show notes for the podcast every week, but it includes the list of the upcoming LitRPG stuff that came out this week, and of course our reviews. So if you're not into, if you can't watch it or listen to it, but you still want the information every week, this is kind of the way that I get that out there. And it can, all the same things you're seeing now in the show notes are kind of just sent to you on a weekly basis. But again, it's once a week. and you don't get anything else from us, like ads or anything. So, but I will thought, okay, you know what? We have a thing. People kind of like it. So we'll make that one way to enter, because of course we can also get your email information too, so we can contact you if you win. That's an important part of this whole process, being able to contact you. Another way you can enter is to like our Facebook, our Twitter, or our YouTube pages. Just simply follow us or like us. And that's a very easy way to get an entry into our particular contest and giveaway. I'll have a link for all those and all those places in the show notes, of course. And of course, last, but this is kind of the fun one for me at least, send us an email. Send us make a post on our Twitter and Facebook page or YouTube page about your favorite LitRPG podcast episode or story or event or review or news story or whatever else it is, or just like something about the podcast that you like and you enjoy. I actually plan to take those particular entries and read them on the air between now and or by episode 100 as a kind of way of saying just to say and respond to like, oh, these are the things that people like about the show. These are their favorite moments. Maybe I'll do like a little what are they called? Flashback to that particular thing. You never know. But these are also just ways to have a fun time with you guys who are the listeners and the watchers. And again, each one of those ways, each one of those things that you do can get you an entry into like a chance to win. Now, some of the prizes you can win include Audible codes, an ebook from either myself or another LitRPG author. We have a couple people who have donated their products, including Alaron Kong, David Wilmarth, some other people as well. And as more people decide to participate in this one or just kind of give things away, I'll add more names to the list, of course. You can also win signed print editions of some physical copies. Like I have physical copies of Project Alpha, Adventures on Terra, and I'll be more than happy to sign those and actually mail them to you. If you live in the United States or Canada, somewhere I can mail it to you, and it's not international, that's super expensive. So, but there are some other things I'd be more than happy to send out to international people, including like Audible codes. If they work for you, I think there are differences between them. But ebooks definitely shippable that way, but also the big grand prize is going to be a $100 Amazon gift card, which will be announced as like the big prize on episode 100. But of course, between now and then, for episode number 96, 97, 98, 99, and 100, I'll be giving away stuff every single week on the podcast as a way to kind of celebrate again the fact that we're going to hit episode 100. Oh yeah, at some point. So that's it for LitRPG news. Hopefully you guys will be willing to participate in this, and we'll have this nice big thing. So there you go. Okay. These are some stories that are out now, but I haven't reviewed, but they are out currently. This includes Harmon Cooper's Fantasy Online. I believe this is the third novel in that series. We also have Halcyon Rising, Bastion of Hope Book 2. I'm not sure if I'm going to review it. Depends on the schedule. I wasn't super interested the last time, but we'll see how that goes. The Trash Tier Dungeon is also out, written by Kay Fairburn. She's written another little bit story previously, so this is her second entry into the genre. And Fragged 8 is out. I won't be reviewing that one. Kind of dropped the series because it stopped being LitRPG and just stopped being entertaining for me. It's also a short story series, so I'm sure the author plans to put them together. But if you're into that series, number 8 is out currently. So there we go. Now, new audiobooks. There are quite a few new audiobook LitRPGs out this week, including World Keeper, Dawn of an Era Book 2 in that series, Patronia Online Book 2, Desert Born, narrated by Andrea Parsonu, written by Don Chapman, is out now. Also, the audiobook for Life in the North. That's a really popular LitRPG title. It's a post-apocalyptic future with game mechanics and survival stuff and, hordes of monsters. It is out as an audiobook as well. As is Continue Online Part 4, Crash, written by Seven Morse, friend of the podcast. And it is narrated by Pavi Provoskio. There you go. And those are all audiobooks that are out currently for you guys to enjoy and to listen to. I'll drop some links in the show notes for the reviews for the ebooks versions of all those things. So in case you forgot what they were, or you never had a chance to read the ebook, you can get a sense of like whether it might be for you or not. But I guess, of course, as always, because they're audiobooks, there's also a special component of the narrator's voice. So I always encourage you to go listen to the sample before you purchase, just in case the narrator's voice doesn't really mesh with your ear muscles or your auditory senses. Okay, upcoming LitRPG. This is just where I read off the new stuff that I know that's coming in the future. You can skip it if you want to, but there are quite a few new entries in this particular list, including Immortal Kalika, Episode 1, written by the author Belrart Wright. There we go. Also new on the list is The Lionheart, a LitRPG novel. No Respawn, book number 1. Of Kingdom Level 4 is still scheduled for February the 28th, and I forget to read those dates. I think I did. Lionheart is out on February 27th. Immortal Kalika is out on February the 16th, so just upcoming on this Friday. Kingdom Hearts Level 4 on February 28th. On February 28th as well, it's going to be Dragon Seed, a LitRPG Dragonrider adventure. On the 20th of February as well, a lot of books scheduled for the 28th of February. Avatar's Rising, Silos number 1. Also on February the 28th is going to be Dual Reality 2071. On March the 6th is going to be Restart, the Dark Paladin book number 3. New to the list is going to be on March. Sorry, this is an item that is new to the list. It is called Outpost, a LitRPG adventure in the Maces, Monsters, and Magic book series, out on March the 7th. Sicora Online is going to be out on March the 9th. This is book 1 in the series called The Sorting. Are reviewing on the podcast book 0, which the author says is supposed to be a kind of prequel into this series, and doesn't have potentially the same main character as book 1. So it's kind of a different, but in the same kind of universe. It also out on March the 15th is going to be Permadeath Online book number 2, and Don Chapman's A Killer's Reign is going to be out on March the 16th. And again, new to the list is going to be Ghost in the Game by Christopher Knee, out on March the 19th, I believe. That's still correct. I'll double check. Okay, that's it for the new releases and reviews. I'm sorry, for upcoming LitRPG. On to new releases and reviews. And the new releases and reviews. We have our first book, which is going to be Wave the Shaman, book number 7, The Clans War. There we go. Written by Vasily Manko. Okay, this one is 341 pages, $5.99. It is not available on Kindle Unlimited. So you might question whether or not you need to read this or not. I'd say if you're a fan of the series and you didn't like how book 6 ended, definitely pick up. This is a lot more fulfilling. It has a lot more conclusion for a lot of the quest lines. But if you liked the way book 6 ended, like you were really satisfied with that, you don't really have to pick this up. Basically, books 1 through 6, book 6 does a decent enough job of ending the series. That's a pretty good ending. But if you just want a little more adventure, go get it. It's, I don't know that you're probably not going to regret it. Okay. The author's description. Not long ago, Daniel Mahan, known to everyone as the Shaman Mahan, thought that he had taken his 6th and final step in the Barcelona game world. Yet life has other ideas. The corporation decides to resurrect the Lord of Shadow and his entire host. The corporation's CEO personally pushes the reset button. Guernica and his Dragon of Shadow spring back to life as, meanwhile, the corporation makes an offer the Shaman can't refuse. Okay, that's basically like the first 5% of the novel is that section of it. It's just a real quick recap saying, reset. That's what the corporation decided to do to kind of justify another story in the series. Remember that I once interviewed Vasily Mahenko, and he said he originally had his series planned for I think it was 4 or 5 books. And then he remembered he had a contract that said he had to write 7. So he kind of had to stretch it and also add more material to fulfill that 7-book contract. And this book is definitely, it has a feel of almost like an add-on. Like book 6 felt like a good ending of, it felt like the end of the RPG game that you bought out of the store. Book 7 feels like the DLC campaign that you could download later to expand that story and also give you some more time to adventure with your favorite characters. And that's what this feels like in a lot of ways. This is the final novel in the way of the Shaman series, but of course, according to the author and the company that publishes in English, they said there are going to be more stories set in this world, but not necessarily with Mahan as the main character. He may make guest appearances and you'll see other characters, but the way the Shaman series is done, it's finished. It's been finished for quite a few years for the author, as far as when he originally wrote it. So remember, we're just getting the English translations of it. This novel, however, is a roller coaster ride, a plot twist, story development, and like I said, it feels more like the DLC you'd buy after finishing the original storyline for an RPG kind of game. It does a really interesting job of like trying to finish off as many storylines from this series as possible, but it also does a lot of new stuff, and there legitimately so many plot twists and so many new things that kind of pop out at you that the reveal of like, oh, an invasion from a rival continent is coming, and that's like the smallest storyline in the entire thing. I don't want to spoil anything for you, but I had a good time with it. But again, it does feel a little bit like, oh, the author is just trying to have a good time. Like there were fewer justifiable reasons for these twists than there were in the past in the storylines. It's just like the author's like, oh, this is my last hurrah. I'm going to make this good. Even if it doesn't always make like 100% sense, it's still rather entertaining. So for me, I had a nice time with Mahan as like this last ride in the series. So I give it a score of 7 out of 10. But again, if you're wondering whether or not you should spend the money for it, I'm like, it kind of depends on what you felt about book 6. If you were okay with that, if you thought that was a good ending, yeah, then I think you're okay. You don't actually have to buy this. I think you'll be satisfied with what you have. But if you were the kind of person who always buys that DLC content for those RPG games just to get a little more story, even if it changes the way you see the ending of the series, then this is probably something you'll want to pick up. There you go. Okay, on to our next review, which is going to be 7th Talon, Dragonrider's Fury. This is 7th Talon book 1 in the series, written by James G. Patton. He's the author of the Office Wars series, also known as, this is not in that same series, but he does call it a Odotech Online series, because it's set in the same kind of a multiverse. Remember, part of that series is that there's a VR world, like a hub almost, but they're also like separate VR worlds attached to it. So it's very much a multi-universe kind of storytelling opportunity, but the author tries to connect everything in subtle ways that, you know, if you haven't read their stuff, you won't miss. But if you have read his other stuff, it's like, oh, that was a nice nod kind of stuff. Okay, this one is 444 pages, $4.99. It is on Kindle Unlimited, which is always nice. Here's the author's description. Beware, the Dragonrider's Fury. Even the gods fear its justice, the first Dragonrider. Bo's Journal, March 13th, N 167, which is a time code method in the series. Kind of gives you a way to compare like where this is compared to the Office Wars. Continuing on the description, it started with a card in a cafe, an invitation to an exclusive world called 7th Talon, and it only asked one question before I agreed. Do you want to become a Dragonrider? It said nothing about guns, magic, or heavy metal. Those were just added incentive. It also said nothing about the secrets, betrayals, and politics of a dragon-run society. Dragons that would rather eat me than listen to what I had to say. Horrible way to win an argument, in my opinion. Nor did it tell me that the biggest enemy I would have to fight was myself. Okay, now the author has a really big note here saying that the main character of this book does not leave this game world, the 7th Talon. If you're curious about the first chapter, Odotech Online, and Neurorama, please read Office Wars series. Office Wars takes place in the same world, just a different part of Odotech, and follows a different character arc. It provides a lot more information about Neurorama, Odotech, the sectors, and he does have Easter eggs in them to reward readers who read everything, which is what I've already said. Okay, now there are a few notes that I just want to let you know about before you read this again. The author isn't kidding. If you're expecting anything like Office Wars, if you love James Patton's Office Wars series and you expect this to be anything like it, it's not. It really isn't. This is more fantasy, action adventure with dragons and maybe some flintlock stuff and heavy metal swords, but there's definitely guns. There's guns, like real like World War II guns and like rifle guns, but there's also magic. So it's very different from Office Wars. So don't expect that. Also know that in the version that I read, which is like the first one that came out in the first days or so, there are an unusual number of spelling and grammar errors, and even some like unfinished sentences. We get to like, oh, that probably should have been cut out in editing, or like something was cut out during editing. And it's just something I noticed because most of the other authors' other works were very polished, and this one just, for some reason, just a few more errors than there are in his other stories. Okay. Having said that, I personally would have loved like just a little more connection to the Odotech universe. I know the author says in advanced there isn't in the story, but I think the introduction would have gone a little smoother and a little better had there just been like a little more explanation about the larger Odotech universe, that it is a virtual reality universe, that the world itself is like the world is not in a great state, and most people spend their time in this virtual reality capsule and in this virtual reality hub where they can go to these different worlds, because that's not fully fleshed out in the story, at least in the introduction. There's also not explanation about the technology in the pods that allows for, and this is not too spoilery because the author said I could say it, the healing of sicknesses and illnesses, and almost keeping humans alive indefinitely, almost a kind of immortality. That is not explained at all in this book whatsoever. There is like a paragraph where the talk about a little bit, but I would have loved to see just a little more of that, just like a paragraph or something, just so some of the other like tech points in the story would have made more sense. Okay. Generally though, this is a good series. Like, if you read the other books, you read the Office stories, you're going to make sense. There are some cool things in the story. I love the magic system. I love the game mechanics and story, and I love the world on a fundamental level. Really, I do. This is a very, like, the author does really great detail work as far as that game mechanics making sense and making them cool. He, the world itself reminds me a lot of, what's the name of that series? Naomi Novak's Temeraire series that combines dragons and flintlock, except that in this case they're more modern weapons, and it also includes like magic. But if you love those kind of series like Dragonriders, the Riders of Pern, the Dragonriders of Pern, that kind of stuff, if you're into those series, this is probably going to be another favorite for you. Just because it has dragons. I mean, it's hard to get over the enjoyment of riding dragons. There's also some other cool stuff, of course, including I like the beginning of the story. The beginning of the story starts the main character off in a starter zone where the players or champions are tested to see who they are and how they go through a series of tests that determine who they are, what they like, and how that actually affects their stats in the game. So like the choices they make in the starter zone, whether they're good choices, bad choices, clever choices, whatever the case is, it actually affects their stats. And I thought that was kind of a cool way of finishing off your character creation. Some of it is determined like, oh, I want this particular stat or this magic skill, or I choose this race that has the bonuses. But some of it is beyond your conscious control. Like the game determines, oh, you're particularly clever or you're good at shooting because of your actions have shown this. And so you get these bonuses. So like, okay, that's a really cool game mechanic, which is, again, one of the things I love about this particular novel. It was kind of a disappointing that some of the antagonists in this beginner zone kind of disappear after the main character leaves it. I would have loved to have seen them kind of get their comeuppance in this story, because they really weren't nice people and they really weren't likable. But from the author, what the author has told me, we've chatted a little bit about the review. He says they're going to come back in later books and they're going to get what they deserve in a way. Now, much of the story after the testing of the island, again, just reminds me of Naomi Novak's Temeraire series. It combines dragon riding and guns, which is great, and heavy metal, which is, great for some people. I'm not as into heavy metal, but I can appreciate the love of a musical genre like that. Magic is a really big thing in the world, and again, it's complicated enough to remain interesting, but it's relatively simple enough to understand, even if you're like into RPG or magic systems. But again, the series the novel as a whole really does veer more towards fantasy, as opposed to what Office Wars was. It veered towards more like modern world gaming and like tournament kind of stuff. So this is, again, a very different kind of novel. There are threats from evil forces in this novel, and it creates some great excuses for fighting some very unusual monsters. So good stuff in there. Now, those are the things I liked about the story. And again, I really do love the world that this is based in. It's super detailed, like on that respect. But my enjoyment level of the novel was dropped because of some things. The main character in the novel, her name is Bo. She's tough, she's stubborn, and she's very grating sometimes, and she's aggressive and very angry. And these attributes were normally part of a character development arc where the main character becomes a bit softer, through trials or after some vulnerability is shown over the course of the story, kind of balancing out the personality of it. And, the jerk with the heart of gold. Or another example, this would be like the, what's his name? Clint Eastwood kind of character, where Clint Eastwood's characters are always strong and they're gruff, and they're sometimes just jerks. And they're very unlikable at the beginning. But then somewhere along the storyline, you get to see another side of that character and some vulnerability. And you see that he's really has a heart of gold in some respect, or at least he's a little more empathetic, and so you can care about the character a little more. And for me, that just didn't happen with the story, or at least with this character, at least from the viewpoint that I read about. And I'll get to that qualifier in a second. There's one place in the story about the middle where the main character does kind of have an emotional breakdown and she cries. But outside of that one instance, there is no more vulnerability shown for her character. And it was just kind of unfortunate because it makes the character much harder to like and enjoy. And that was kind of the thing. I kept wanting her to like the character, but she gave me very few reasons to do so, besides being just like badass. She would often, though, just be very stubborn and angry for no reason and lash out at people. And it's a character choice. Let's see. Now, the author, again, messaged me about the review when he read it on Amazon, and he mentioned something that I mentioned in the review. In the written form of this review, I mentioned that the main character has multiple sclerosis. And it's something that comes up repeatedly in the story as like, something she talks about in the past terms. As like, in the real world, she has multiple sclerosis and she doesn't want to return to her body, so she spends all her time in the game world. And in this particular world, she feels, strong and free, but also still angry because she knows she keeps referring to getting it. If she goes back, she'll feel like she's trapped in her broken body. And I thought that might have been a great opportunity to show that vulnerable, or at least that other side of like why she feels angry all the time. Except that we never see it. We're told about it a little bit. There are a few sequences when she's like recalling past memories. And her issues with that, and like the doctor's telling her that, she's not gonna be able to walk again, her father's, reaction to it and their relationship and that kind of stuff. But we're never shown what it actually feels like for her to be in that condition in the world, because the story, again, never actually leaves the game world. It sends her there, and she's there the entire series, apparently, according to the author. Now, the author mentioned that there's a really good reason why he doesn't show her having MS, is because she doesn't have it anymore. According to him, there's a paragraph in the story that says that her MS is cured because of the pods. And again, that's not something you would necessarily connect if you haven't read the other series, which totally, I'm like, oh yeah, that's right, that does do that. And he showed me in text, like, oh, it's right. There's like basically a couple sentences say in there that she's cured, but she never wants to go back to that body just in case it's not true. And he mentioned, the author mentioned to me that he did that so that the character would have a sense of a victim mentality, because she doesn't know if she's really cured or not. She's lived her life for quite a while with that particular condition. He kind of mentioned that, maybe I have just like first impression bias, and that didn't really affect my ultimate review of the novel. But I wanted to make sure you guys knew the author's response to that particular review point, for me at least. Okay. But again, the main character is strong, but she's kind of rock hard, in my opinion. So she's strong and gruff, but again, she doesn't have that side or those moments of vulnerability, and her character doesn't soften. And the author mentioned that her character is not going to soften. It's only going to get worse, and she's going to do some really bad things forward in the series. So it's just going to be a thing. Hopefully, when I read book 2, this new information will help me understand the character better. But for now, it's just that relationship with the main character. Just was part of the reason why I didn't enjoy the novel quite as much as I think I could have. Because again, I love the game. It was just like the main character. It was hard for me to empathize with her because she was so mean and she was so gruff and she was just so, to me, just kind of unlikable. So that's what it is. Now, another point that I wanted to mention that just kind of brought it down for me was her relationship with her dragon, Malonite. The relationship feels very forced. In the story, there are things that happen that are akin to a magical invasion, or even for some people, like a magical version of rape. At least it's not a physical version of it. It's like a bonding experience, but it's forced on her. And that kind of situation to me seemed very traumatic. And yet the relationship between those two characters, between the dragon and her, later on in the novel, just is kind of like, oh, she forgives him. Like, oh, well, I don't really blame you. And I felt like it was something that should have been a little harder. And maybe that's just my opinion, but it felt like it was a kind of a forced characteristic to justify something that the dragon does later on as kind of a redemptive act. And so for me, it's like, because it felt forced, because I didn't feel like it was natural, especially for a character who was so angry all the time, who held such grudges. I was like, okay, this doesn't make sense. It feels kind of forced. So mostly those two things are the things that kind of drop the enjoyment level for me just enough so that it's not quite a 7 out of 10. Overall, the story is fine. A lot of other people are going to really enjoy the story. They're not going to be as picky about these particular just things that bugged me. And, have a really good time. Like this is kind of a fun story. The game world, totally love. It's just that there's a few story issues for me that just like, and like, I wanted like the story more than I could, unfortunately. So, the score, I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10. Like, so a lot of people will probably ignore it or like it more. And they can ignore those things. I just couldn't. So for me, it's score 6 out of 10. That's 7 Talon, book 1, Dragonrider's Fury, with a score of 6 out of 10. There you go. Okay, on to our next review, which is going to be Respawn, Lives 1 through 5, written by Arthur Stone. Again, he's the author of the Wittish Noob series. So this is another Russian story translated into English. It is 329 pages. It is $5.92. It's almost double what I would normally pay. It is also not available on Kindle Unlimited. So we'll talk about in a little bit if it's worth your purchase or not. Okay. This is the author's description. You are no one. Level 0. Empty of mind and memory. Even your past has been stripped from your brain by the inscrutable system. A long, difficult road lies between you and remembering any part of who you are. A road punctured with one death after another. You are too puny to survive by might alone. Information is the single resource that may keep you alive. But the brainless digis have none of it. Only those with experience can give you what you need, but most are nothing about you. But most care nothing about you or your plight. In fact, some may make it their mission to kill you, so you will die again and again. Your life counter clicking lower and lower, and even the creators do not know what happened if your counter reaches 0. But many are sure that your last life here is just that, no more respawns. You are not the first player in the world of Styx, and you will not be the last. You can only hope luck will be on your side. The luckiest players are those who find a vulnerability in the system, those they call cheaters. Perhaps cheating is the only way to win. Enjoy your game. So that's a really long introduction. But it does set up like the beginning part of the novel for the reader. Like that's basically the beginning story. The story starts out with the man with no memory set up, where the main character, who doesn't have a name, he wakes up in a dorm room. He doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know how he got there. He doesn't know what's going on. He just complete blank for him. He can still talk and he has memories like history events, math and whatever, but he doesn't know any personal history for himself. He quickly dies fighting a monster, only to respawn in the same place he woke up. While the main character tries to figure out what's happening, he gets some strange messages about stats, levels, XP, and a bunch of other RPG mechanics he doesn't really understand or get. And that's basically what this story is, and that's the beginning. I welcome to the story I best describe as a digital apocalypse Groundhog Day with RPG powers. And that's a mouthful, but I think it fairly describes the beginning. The constant respawning in the beginning of the story is definitely that Groundhog Day feel. There's RPG powers galore, but a lot of the story is about the main character surviving this kind of digital apocalypse and figuring out those rules. at least the first half of that story is basically what this is. Again, he wakes up and he keeps dying and respawning, kind of learning each time some of the rules, some of what these RPG mechanics are, and just fighting off monsters in like this apocalypse settings. And again, a lot of the story later on is a lot more about the survival aspects of like a post-apocalyptic world. But he also meets other people like him who are, I don't want to say players because that's not the word they use. They call them, I think, immunes. And they call the people who are turning into monsters, digis, as like base characters. And then eventually they get infected and they become these different monsters, including like zombie characters and then other like worse monsters. And they call them, I think, the infected. And the first half of the novel really is about the main character just figuring things out and figuring out the game rules and trying not to die quite as much. And just like getting little hints from the system about, little mechanics here and there. And part of the enjoyment I had with the first half of the story was just going along with the main character and guessing what these mechanics were, or like seeing these hints and knowing myself, that means this RPG mechanic. But him as a character being like, I don't know games. What the heck is this? And he does again meet other characters who like himself that give him little hints and gifts here and there, because even though it's new for him, like they've been respawning for like 5 or 6 or 7 levels, and they've gained levels as you know, as they progress. And so there are different levels of characters with different guns and who have more experience about it. But every time the main character dies, the whole system, the whole area is reset again. And so it always starts out with him in his bed. And then gradually things just kind of go to heck in a handbasket. So it's a very interesting kind of mesh there in the first half. Now the second half is a little more predictable in the fact that it's more about like him meeting another survivor or woman who kind of shows him the ropes and explains a lot of the mechanics to him. And then it's their relationship and just dealing with other players or other characters who are like him, only they're evil and they hurt other people like them because they're like it's like player versus player, and that they don't mind hurting other people. And there's a whole storyline there for that. The novel is again like this weird mix of apocalypse survival, monster killing, RPG progression, and it's not going to be for everybody. If you're not into like survival apocalypse stories, you're probably not going to like this. It's just you either you enjoy that kind of stuff or you don't. But it does again mix in RPG mechanics, and like and this is a little spoiler as far as the mechanics go, but like things like keeping yourself well fed, like there's a bar like that has to be satisfied. The same thing with drink or with pleasure or with your health, or with like there's a special like drink they have to drink to make sure that they continue to like heal rapidly and like and increase their powers, kind of stuff. And there's a bunch of that kind of things there, so a lot of game mechanics in here, but it's also combining some other kind of genre kind of stuff, and it's a nice interesting mix if you're into that kind of stuff. If you're not, it's not going to work for you. But for me, I like all those things. I like apocalypse survival stories. I'm into like zombie apocalypse stories. And of course, I love LitRPG, so it's a nice little mix for me. It's also a nice break from fantasy stories, because a lot of the stuff, especially this week, I think everything else is a fantasy LitRPG. And so the fact that this one was a nice break from all that, at least for me. So for me, you get a score of 7 out of 10. That's Respawn Lives 1 through 5, with a score of 7 out of 10. Okay, on to our next story. There we go. It is written by S.W. Clark, Sicora Online, Book 0, The Ringer. Okay. This one is 149 pages. It is $2.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. And let me check real quick. I think the author said she was going to change the price tag on that to 99 cents. And nope, still same price. Never mind. She did not change that. But price point wise, it's a little expensive. It's about, again, double what I would normally pay. I would say it's not really worth the price tag as a purchase. You may enjoy it as a Kindle Unlimited read, though. That's something you'll have to determine for yourself. I'll get into my review, though, after I read the author's description, of course. The author's description. What you do when the game is too tough? Why, of course, you will bring in a ringer. And I lost my place. Darn you. Okay. On his first night as a beta tester for Sicora Online, 21-year-old Galen Cole meets the clone Prairie Ringer Powell. He is he isn't sure what to make of Prairie. She's engineered for violence, a maestro with the bow, and a real wild card. But they need each other. Galen and Prairie are two of the first batch of testers for the game that has a tendency to stomp on its players. Fresh from debugging, Sicora Online is an ever-shifting world whose AI has been programmed to alter its level based on the personalities inside. But Sicora needs to feed before she can blossom into an MMORPG. She must learn human behavior, motivations, and reactions to setbacks. Enter the level crawl. 10 days, 10 unpredictable worlds, and if Galen survives, he'll be granted his heart's desire, a lifetime of free access to Sicora Online, but first he has to survive. So there you go. That's the author's description. Okay. My view basically the first thing I noticed is that the person on that cover is like a lady, is a girl. So you would think that the main character of the story is a woman, and it's not. It's a dude. So first off, I think that's just that gives readers a different expectation of when they're reading. The main character, who's a guy, Galen, he is one of 24 testers in this new full immersion game called Sicora. They're supposed to test the game in some way, and if they make it throughout 10 levels, they win a lifetime subscription. Basic, right? Except that the premise is a little thin. For me at least, and is very kind of poorly described. There are no directions about what the testers are supposed to be testing, and what it takes for them to beat a level. And each level is very different from the next one. And they basically get in the first level, they get, I think it's 3 lives before they're kicked out of the entire project. And then after that, if they die at all, second level, third level, whatever it is, they're kicked out of the project entirely. And that's not exactly said in the beginning of the story. It's something you discover as you continue on. Essentially, the characters and the main character in particular is just dropped off somewhere in the level, and there's like, figure it out. They're not given direction, they're not given goals or guidelines, and it's just, go figure some stuff. So it's like I said, the premise is a little ambiguous, and maybe that's the author's intention of like creating an open world kind of vibe to it. But it's like, okay. Now, the early part of the story in the first level describes, actually before he even gets into the game, he describes the main character's infatuation with the clone Prairie, who I can only assume is the lady on the cover. I'm pretty sure she is. She partners with him for no real reason, just that, this is how the story goes. So there you go. By the 8% mark in the story, the main character is dropped in the game world, and he finds himself meeting magical creatures and helping them to stop the bad guys from killing them. I don't want to spoil details in case you actually want to read the story. But along the way, he finds Prairie, who was dropped off somewhere else, and she joins his party. Now, this is part of the story is where the main character and the reader get most of the information about the RPG mechanics in the story. Like they describe things like character sheets, stats, health, mana bars, item descriptions, skill descriptions, all that stuff. It's not special, but it's not bad either. It's detailed, and it follows through the entire story. But this is the section where you get most of that information and where it appears the most. Now, even though you do get all this information, oftentimes the information you're giving kind of doesn't seem like it means much when it conflicts with where the author wants the story to go. And I'll give you a particular example. At one point in the story, an NPC centaur one shot kills like 5 players with the bow and arrow. Even though just like a few paragraphs prior to, he was really struggling to kill the main character, who is a level 1 character and basically doesn't have any gear. And yet this same centaur just murders 5 other players without any real trouble. Like he literally just, and so just like that one scene kind of notified me very quickly that, these rules don't really matter if the story says something has to happen or the story has to go in a bigger place. And that's always a balancing act for a LitRPG author, because many authors are like, I'm story first no matter what. And that works well when you don't have a system of rules that may contradict it, and people are going to check your math or check like the game logic at least, so that those kind of rule logics. And this is maybe just a personal opinion, a lot of times the more successful LitRPG stories, their story is at least partially dictated by what is allowed within the game rules that they've established. And when those game rules seem to be ignored for whatever reason, whether it's story or just you don't want the main character to die or whatever it is, readers notice, and it almost feels like you're breaking the rules that you established, and that's kind of what happens when the story, when it's convenient. Other times, the game rules are very much followed. It's really just like one of those things that just kind of bothers me, and I know it bothers a lot of other readers when it feels like, oh, you put game rules in there, but if you're not going to follow them, what's kind of the point? You know what I mean? The entire scene. Section in this first level is very fantasy game world. And another thing that kind of happens in this first section is that there's just like this really abrupt time shift. Like one moment, the main character is like, oh, I gotta go save this girl. You guys gonna come with me? And they're like, yeah, let's go. And then bam, they're tied up and they're just dying. And there's nothing in the middle. It's literally, let's go do this. And then next sentence, we're all tied up and we're bleeding to death. And then bam, the level ends. And it's just, I'm like, just storytelling wise, it was just a very abrupt shift for absolutely no reason. And maybe it's just the author like, oh, this is a short story. I don't want to spend too much time on this level. I have other things to write. That's fine. It's just that those kind of storytelling jumps, it just bugged me because I'm like, what's happening between here and here? Like, that happens in just about every level that you experience in this particular novel. And again, it's a short story, so the author, of course, wants to keep a particular word count, keep it short, because she has a whole other novel to write, the first book in the series. So I kind of get that. It's just that reading it, it bugs me. Okay, now, after that first level, the main character is pulled out of the game because somebody else beats the level, which is never explained how or why. It's, again, one of those just like kind of plot holes. It's like, oh, it happens. Okay. And after the 33% mark of the novel, the novel kind of ceases to be LitRPG in a lot of ways. Instead, it kind of becomes this poorly executed attempt at creating a virtual reality version of Westworld, at least to me. The NPCs in these various levels are recycled, and so you see them being killed again and again and again by players, by each other. But like the main character and his groups on level 1, oh, you see them again in level 2 and then level 3, and they're being murdered again and again and again. Except that in each one of these levels, it's a different scenario or it's a different condition. For example, in the first level, fantasy. It's a prairie. It's a fantasy, magical fantasy world, right? Level 2. It's the Wild West. So even then, like that's a little close to what Westworld is. And then in level 3, it is a modern world setting in the year 2102. So it's a slightly in the future. But again, there are like just modern guns and trolleys, and it's a big city, and there's explosives galore kind of system. So it's a more modern setting, and it's just like this inconsistency between those worlds that I guess bothers me as a reader and as somebody who really appreciates the consistency of an RPG world, because each one of those worlds works very different. Like the goals are different, the way combat works is different, yet the character system is kind of static and it's the same no matter what world it inhabits. So that feels like you're changing the rules again, without always telling the reader how those rules change necessarily. So again, it's just one of those things. Like, and again, starting in the second world, outside of the character sheets updates and the distribution of like those stat points that the author does again in the beginning of each one of those worlds, a lot of the RPG mechanics actually just disappear. Like I said, most of what you're going to see is in that first level, but in levels 2 and 3, and in the Old West and in like the modern world, you just see a lot fewer. Like you see occasional item descriptions or losses of health during combat. It's just, even those things just kind of appear less. And again, the game mechanics just feel like they don't matter to the story, or like the story was written in advance, and then afterwards the author went back and then like, oh, this is a damage notification, should go here, or like an item description can go here because the main character gets a gun or whatever. But it's a lot of it feels unacknowledged in the actual story. So it's like, oh, between paragraphs, put up a few entries and there's an description that should satisfy those folks. And I mean, I'm not saying that's the author's intent or that's what she actually did, but because the game mechanics don't always like feel like they impact the actual story, that's kind of how I felt about them. So I kind of like the stuff that happened the first 30%. It's fairly detailed, and again, the mechanics, like, they matter a little bit more. more than the rest of the story, I should say. And it had potential to be very interesting. But again, after that, it kind of loses me because it feels less like a LitRPG story and just more like a virtual reality simulation that kind of mimics Westworld. And maybe that works for some people, but as a LitRPG story, it didn't really work for me, unfortunately. Had the game mechanics continued after in the same manner they did previously, or had I felt like they mattered more in the story and they weren't just there like they didn't feel like they were just inserted in post, it would have a better score. But again, even with that, like the shifting rules and the time frames and like the skipping, just like the sudden skips in story, really would have been a big issue for me. As it is, I didn't like the story. It wasn't like it wasn't just not entertaining. I actually didn't like it because of those things just bothered me so much. And I'm like, and it is what it is. I gave it a score of 4 out of 10. There you go. That's Sicora Online, The Ringer, a LitRPG story. I actively didn't enjoy it very much. So gets a score of 4 out of 10. There we go. Okay. Next story. This one is written by Tom Hansen. It is Eloria's Beginning. A LitRPG GameLit epic entered the louVRe. It's a play on words in the story. It's a joke. It's an inside joke. Okay, this one is 491 pages. It is $5.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. Okay, I'll read you the author's description. One life, stolen memories. Gaming has consequences when the AI won't let you leave. In the battle to save his race, Scarhoof is the last guard standing. If the old shaman fails to protect Sunset Cove, the defenseless minotaurs in his care will fall into the enemy's scaly clutches. But on the other side of the VR console, far more than Scarhoof's game world is at stake. Adriana and her team of programmers are in for some long nights on the job. Epoch International's latest immersive game wasn't supposed to be released for months, but the AI had other plans. Now it's trapped players in the simulation and holds their memories hostage. If Adriana can't hack her way in, Scarhoof and the other players could be lost for forever. So, excuse me, there you go. Okay, now basically there are 2 stories in this novel. They don't ever cross. Like some of the information you will get from the first story kind of reveals some potential details in the second story, but they really don't ever cross. Like one's in the real world, one is in the game world, and they don't ever, like the characters from the first story are into the second, and the second are into the first, so they're very separate. And the author says he did this on purpose, and there's a reason why, apparently, to him. I should say to him. Okay, the first story is a thriller about artificial intelligence that was created by a game company to create the next generation of full immersion virtual reality. The AI takes over the game company and launches their planned game ahead of schedule. This story is about the game company trying to spin the launch, and so it makes it seem like they did it on purpose and so they don't lose investors or get lawsuits. And the game company just kind of learning about how much control the artificial intelligence has over the game. Even going so far as trapping players and wiping their minds. This is roughly 8% of the overall story. And I'll say up front, I like this part the best. Like this part is quite interesting. It's almost this techno thriller aspect, and it's really high energy, and it has a good pace to it, and it's really it's interesting. It never gets boring, at least for me. But again, it's also only 8% of the story. The other 92% is set in the second game. It's set in the game world, which is generally a good thing for a LitRPG story. And the second story in this novel is, again, takes entirely in the game world that the artificial intelligence launched. It's told from the perspective of a player whose mind has been wiped and whose memories have been replaced with game backstory. He thinks he's lived his entire life in this world as a, we'll say Minotaur, just for, like the author uses a different word. He has, his own word for the Minotaur race. But he thinks he's lived his entire life as a Minotaur, including backstory, history. He had time in a war, PTSD, a bunch of other things. And he's now becoming a shaman. He goes on adventures, quests, fights some pretty neat battles later in the story. But that's what that second story is. And again, it doesn't intersect with the first story at all. When you're in the game world, this is this guy's story. When you're in the real world, it's that other techno-thriller thing. Now, the concept for the second story isn't bad. It really isn't. It's actually quite interesting. Like, it's like the author thought, what if you told the story of an NPC, except don't make him a player because his memory's wiped. And I think that has some very interesting potential storylines, because if the artificial intelligence is essentially determining this guy's memory, it becomes like a story of like, oh, how does he get it back? What happens when he starts to get clues? Does that change his behavior? Can he still struggle against the artificial intelligence? And so that it's a really cool potentiality there for like some cool stuff. But the actual execution in this particular story, in this novel, isn't as neat, unfortunately. And it's kind of a confluence of a couple different things in the story. One part of this is that the author does a really good job of like world building. Like, he creates backstory for the world, for the game world. He creates backstory for the main character. Like the main character has a fully fleshed out history that he remembers as his own, including like having to fight in a war, having injuries that ache, relationships with the villagers, and in particular characters. Like, he has memories of these backstories, and the world at large. His tribe has cultural customs. The larger world, when he gets to it, has its own history and there's interaction between the races, and it's all really fully fleshed out. But because the main character essentially believes he's a part of it, the story is being told from his perspective, almost as if it's just a fantasy story. There is very little acknowledgement that this is actually a game world. And that's unfortunate, because it almost feels like, I'll say, torn fan fiction from World of Warcraft. Like, the Tauren race is a miniature race from World of Warcraft. And a lot of what this feels like is only if it was written as a straight fantasy story. And that's mostly because the game notifications in the story feel like they're inserted in post. And that's always an issue, because it's very hard to make the game world feel integral to your story if you're filling in those notifications and if you're filling in those game mechanics after you've written the main story. And that's kind of what this feels like. It feels like the author intends to write a little bit of story, and like the game mechanics that are there, they're fleshed out, they're detailed, they're nice, but they're inserted in the story in such a way that it almost feels like, oh, the main character's action adventure, he's doing the thing, he's hoeing a field, then there's a notification, and he doesn't acknowledge it exists at all. Like, the reader sees it, there's the implication that the player sees it, or the character sees it, I should say, but then he doesn't acknowledge it. It's just like, oh, then he just goes on his merry way, or he does some other thing. And that's what I'm talking about when I say, like, it feels like it's inserted in post, after the actual story is already finished. And that's just kind of the vibe that I got. I'm not saying that the author didn't make the effort to write a full RPG system. It kind of feels like he did. It's just that a lot of the story, at least in the very beginning, especially, it feels like those mechanics and those notifications were just kind of entered in after the story was already done. And like I said, also because of all that world building, but it's told from the perspective of somebody who lives in this world. Again, it feels like almost like a fantasy story. So there you go. The author, again, makes a great bit of effort. He really does a good job of creating that history and culture. But again, that also just feeds into this feeling like a fantasy story. Because again, there is very little cultural acknowledgement of those RPG mechanics. I'm like, oh, so that's, that is unfortunate. Because like, the writing's really solid. The writing's solid and it's well done. And it's just like, oh, just not really RPG-ish a lot of times. It is what it is. Overall, I like the first story better, and that's not a good sign in a LitRPG story when you like the part that is not in the game world. The second didn't really work for me, and again, some of this is just that the first part of that game world story is kind of boring. It picks up later on. I'm not saying it's boring the entire time, but the very beginning of that is just a lot of fetch quests, picking flowers, collecting items, talking to so-and-so to advance your class or whatever, they don't even say advance your class, like advance your training as a shaman now, that kind of stuff. And again, later on in the story, in the game world story at least, things get more focused, they get more action-driven, and some of the fights at the very end of this are really pretty cool. It's just that a lot of that doesn't happen until after the 50% mark of the story, and a lot of people just aren't going to stick around that long. Like I genuinely like the werewolf storyline. It's good. It pops in and out though. But like 92% of this is just like, it feels like a fantasy story. And the author, again, this is the case. Like when I post these reviews early on Amazon before the podcast, sometimes the author is like right back and they're like, hey, how's it going, dude? But the author, Tom Henson, was very nice about, about this, and I totally just lost what he had written. But he was nice, but he did want me to point out a few things about his particular story that he didn't think that I either noticed or was about. One, he wanted me to mention that the character Scarhoof does have some depth character, and he really does. He has anxiety, he has PTSD, he has survivor's guilt, and the main character and the author try to emphasize those aspects of his personality. But at the same time, those aspects of his personality, and this is me talking, not the author anymore, those are artificial constructs created by the AI in his memory. So it has, to me, it lessens the impact a little bit. But like I said, the character depth of these characters is nice. But it's also written as like almost a fantasy story. And the author kind of acknowledges this in the message that he wrote me. He's like, I did write this more as a epic fantasy than fantasy adventure. And I'm like, yeah, that's totally true. That's kind of what this feels like. And I'm not saying that it's not LitRPG, because they're getting the mechanics are there, the anchored levels. There are, they're not like fully described experience points, but there's a system in place that advances the character and his abilities and his power structure and his shamastic abilities and his spells and stuff. But again, it felt more like fantasy with like some stuff kind of put in post as sort of like RPG mechanics go. And for some people, that's going to be great. Like some people really don't like a super gamey kind of story. For me, I love that kind of story. And there were things I liked about the story. It's just that though that kind of lack of meaning for the game mechanics, or like at least their acknowledgement in a lot of places, just drew it down a little bit for me. So it gets a score of 6 out of 10 for me. Again, not bad, not even boring. It's just not good for me, at least. But some of the people will enjoy it quite a bit, I think. It scores 6 out of 10 for Eloria's Beginning, a LitRPG GameLit epic. Enter the louVRe book 1. Oh, and I want to mention there are some really funny AI jokes and Jurassic Park jokes from like that first rural storyline. Just saying, because the author made me laugh a couple times. But that's a score of 6 out of 10 for this particular novel. There you go. Okay, number 6 out of 7. Here we go. Rogue Online, The Devil's Gate, a LitRPG adventure, the Rogue Land Chronicle Book 1, written by E.K. Baxter and M.E. Galarvi. I think that's it. Okay. 198 pages, $3.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. Okay, this one is... okay, here's the author description. To survive, you must win. Nothing else matters. Max is a top-level gamer, a battle mage with enough power to level a city, or a small village at least. Lots of people want to be him, a few want to kill him, but most just want to kill him. At least in the game. Things in real life ain't so easy. After double-crossing the all-powerful corporation, the shadowy tech company that runs the world's biggest gaming tournaments, Max finds himself on the run. His only chance to escape is to enter the world of Rogue Online, a prototype full immersion game that just might let him evade his enemies. But he soon discovers that Rogue Online isn't the safe haven he'd hoped, especially when he's been stripped of all his abilities he's worked so hard to build. If he wants to get home, Max must use all of his skills and ingenuity to level up and cover the dark conspiracy at the heart of the corporation, the conspiracy that threatens not only Rogue Online, but all of humanity as well. So there you go. Okay, now all that description right there from the author's description of the novel, that's the first 10% of this thing, or the first like 10, 15. It's not it. Most of this is in this game world, and I'll describe it. The first 10% of the story is the best part of the novel. It recounts a big raid fight led by the main character, Max, against the reigning champ, Nightshade. Anyone that's played an MMO will find this section well-described and relatable. And I don't think it's an accident. I mean, that's the sample size. So you want it to be really good. Now, after that, the story becomes RPG portal fiction. Max is supposed to throw the match in the MMO, and when he doesn't, he's chased down by the people who want to kill him, the corporation. He meets a mysterious stranger that offers to help him escape by sending him to a new world where he can be the chosen one. That's literally what it says, ladies and gentlemen. He offers him the chance to be the chosen one. Max agrees, and he's sent to the Rogue Lands, also called Rogue Online for some reason. Like there's a conflict, like the names are interchangeable for some reason. Unfortunately, this is where the story falls apart. In this new world governed by RPG mechanics, Max finds a bunch of familiar RPG stuff. A character sheet, stats, mana, etc., the whole thing. There's a lot of text devoted to the description of how the game mechanics work. But those game mechanics really don't matter. Additionally, the story itself falls very much on the rails in that the main character is kind of led from one situation to another, and he doesn't really make very many decisions the entire novel. So it's kind of a letdown that way as well. Now, details on the game mechanics. In any LitRPG, any LRPG story, the RPG mechanics should feel like they're an important part of the story that affect the world. And even though there's a lot of like numbers and character sheets and stats and stuff and quest description and modifications throughout the entire novel, the mechanics don't really feel meaningful. And again, this is one of those things like that always kind of bugs me a little bit. A good example of this is how health is treated in the story. Even though there were actual stat numbers used in the character sheets, health is represented in the entire novel as percentages. There's no reference point to what the percentages are. Like there's no saying, oh, a character's health is 100 points or 500 points. It's just, I lost 10% of my health when this dude hit me. But even in those instances, those values don't always make sense. And this is an example from the story. At one point in the story, the main character is attacking a bunch of mercenaries, and he kills them, one-shots them with the bow and arrow. This sounds familiar, but he does it with a stat score of like 1 to 3. Like his health, I think his strength score is like 3, and his other stats are like 1, and a few with like 3, which is not very good apparently when you compare it to other characters. But later on, when he fights a character who has a strength of like 25, which is literally almost 10 times what his is, the main character magically avoids all his attacks, or only takes like 10% damage when he's hit. That's what I mean by like, you have game mechanics in here and you have numbers, but they don't mean diddly squat because they don't actually impact what's happening in the story. And that's what happens here. Like I said, there are a lot of other issues with the game mechanics, including like never giving the reader a baseline for what attack damage is. Like there are item descriptions of weapons saying, +5 to attack and +20 to attack or whatever, but the author never really describes what does that mean for like damage or your chances of attacking. It's just something that's kind of skipped over. The stat changes the main character, because as the characters level, you get one stat point to distribute somewhere. But none of those increases in those stats really seem to impact the story at all. Like he's just as weak, or he's just as overly described strong and unbeatable almost, no matter what his stats are and no matter how they change in the story. And again, some of the understreams don't make much sense, and so there are just issues. A lot of the RPG mechanics either feel like, the story is written in a certain way, and mechanics are added second again, or somebody kind of created an RPG system and just didn't finish it all. And that's just kind of the way it felt, at least to me. Like I said, I like the first 10% of this novel. The gameplay in the MMO raid, it feels like it's based on someone's actual experiences as a player. It's very authentic. The premise of the story, it's a little flimsy. You're playing MMO one minute and then you're running for your life because you didn't take a fall during a raid that was streamed over the world. So yeah, the corporation wants to kill you. Okay. And then a stranger you just happen to meet opens a magic portal and sends you through it, where you're the chosen one in an RPG world. I'm like, okay, that's again a little thin. I've read thinner, but it's not like the best premise. Plus, the game world itself, the story in the game world, isn't 100% clear what it actually is. Like I said, there are two titles to this. One is The Rogue Lands, which very much feels like Portal fiction, and that it's a fantasy world ruled by RPG mechanics. But at the same time, it's also called Rogue Online, where it's called, even the creator says, it's the most advanced MMO ever. And I'm like, that wasn't not what it's always presented as. I'm like, it's very inconsistent as far as like the world building, which one it's going to be. Like some characters in the story don't see any of the stuff that the main characters, they don't see levels, they don't see stats, they don't see any of that stuff, but others do. And I'm like, it's a very inconsistent thing. And the story itself is also rather inconsistent. And again, my big issue is the fact that the main character doesn't really have agency. He just kind of does what other people tell him, and he follows a series of like quests and that advance the plot. So there you go. Worst of all, I don't care about the character. Like I really don't. I don't care about the main character. I don't care about anybody in the story because I've never given a reason to. Like there's very little character development in the story as well. So I'm like, it's hard to like really be interested in And when the story doesn't give you a reason to be interested, it's just stuff that happens to dude. So that is what it is. For me, it wasn't like necessarily bad. It just felt half done, and it wasn't really entertaining for me. So it gets a score of 5 out of 10. That's Rogue Online, The Devil's Gate, a LitRPG adventure, The Rogue Lands Chronicle Book 1, with the score of 5 out of 10. There you go. Okay, last review. Okay, this one is called The Grind. It's written by Dante Doom. It is 558 pages, $2.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. I will read you the author's description. One young woman hungers for status in a harsh feudal future, but her greed could become her downfall. In the desolate future state of Very, King Leopold and his lords rule with absolute authority. There's only one way for the oppressive serfs to rise in rank, the MMORPG called The Grind. Once a year, players in this virtual game can fight for opportunity to raise their standing by gathering as many points as possible. Peasants can become nobles, lords, and with enough skill, sometimes kings. Savannah, or Savvy, DeForge is a grinder, the lowest of the low who earns a living racking up points for players by ghosting them in the game. When a wealthy client named Timon comes calling, she sees him as her ticket out of the classless limbo of grinder life. But when her father vanishes in the game, Savvy will have to choose between the advancement she craves and reclaiming the one she loves. A ritual that starts to become terribly real, Savvy realizes there is much more at stake than status, and it may be too late to save anyone, including herself. Now, I think that last little bit there is a little misleading in that very little of the story has anything to do with like her looking for her dad, but we'll get into that. This is from the author Dante Doom. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you may recognize him as a name that's been on some other LitRPG titles. And the author presents himself to readers in the LitRPG community as a gamer and a LitRPG lover who wrote his first novel in 2 weeks. He self-published, and they put out a whole trilogy within a couple of months. Yet he probably doesn't actually exist. I heavily suspect that he's a made-up person or made-up character from the publishers Relay Publishing as a gamer author who appeals to readers, which I wouldn't really have too big of a problem with if they were just honest about it. But in all the literature and all the Amazon author descriptions and in the novel itself, when they describe the author, it's presented as a real person. So I think it's disingenuous. And in episode 71 of the podcast, I'll have a link for the show notes, I actually lay out all the evidence that I collected that this is probably the case, including like an actual conversation I had with the author, Dante Doom, on Facebook, where I actually just at some point asked him if this is the case, because there's, again, the evidence is there, and then the author just stops responding. So like I said, go watch that episode. I have a link in the show notes to that exact point for that review, so you don't have to like look through it in the show notes if you want to look at that particular part of the story. Now, putting that to the side, the review for the novel is a little bit mixed. The novel really starts out great, and I mean wonderfully. Like this is a good opening. The opening scene captures the reader's attention. It doesn't make a mix of like sarcasm and action, but at the same time does a really good job of describing the game elements that are in this story and in this world. The main character, Savannah, is a grinder, someone in the future in this post-apocalyptic world that's been rebuilt of a society that illegally power levels anyone that can pay for her service. In the society she lives in, if you... ranks earned in this game, in the grind, determine one's place in their society. So if you do well doing your game run and you get enough experience orbs, you can be any level of like character or any levels of a class. Like a serf is like the lowest level. You can get to like lords or barons and lords and ladies of the court or something, and then like the king himself if you do well enough. And so it's a very interesting way of making the game stuff really mean something in the real world. And I really actually like that setup. I was genuinely surprised how much I liked the beginning of the story, which just made my disappointment with the rest of it that much worse. And I was like severely disappointed with how the rest of the story played out. Like 'cause at the beginning, I'm like, it's pretty stellar. Like it really is. Like the setup of the world, the way that the systems work together. I'm like, wow. I was like, maybe this is going to be a good one. And I'm like, then I'm like reading the rest. I'm like, oh, darn it, it's not. And like, it is. So, as the novel continues, the main character gets a new client, this noble that needs a good rank in the game to help maintain his family's power at court. It's a way for that to take the reader on like a noob journey. and explain more about how the game works and how it matters to society. Unfortunately, it turns into this argument between the two about how it's great to be noble or how it's not, and how the main character wants to be one of the nobles and live the good life that she thinks that they live. Afterward, the story devolves into this kind of Wizard of Oz kind of story where the main character goes through a series of decently described fights and collects a group of magical friends, one of who's a total ripoff of the Tin Man, to defeat the evil king before he can take control of the game. Now, that on its own, not a horrible plot. It really isn't. It's people like the Wizard of Oz. But the author also tries to mix in a lot of other ideas and story plots, and the whole thing gets really muddled and very uninteresting as it continues on. The author tries to add plot points about the nobles opposing the king and a plot to kill the king. And then the main character is trying to kill the nobles and then she's trying to kill the king. And then she's convinced to, or forced to try to kill the nobles again and back to the king and back and forth several times. And it gets kind of annoying. And then there's also this, it's talked about in the novel description, about her looking for her father who's been stuck in, there is time compression between the game and the world where it's like 1 year for every day of the real world. And so her dad has been missing for a month in the real world, but in game time, it's like 30 years. And yet the main character doesn't really seem to care as she's trying to like get money to, or orbs to increase her ranking eventually. And that, like I said, even though it's in the description of the story, it's a very minor point. Like the main character really doesn't give a hoot about her dad, but that's still part of the story. And then it shifts again to like the main character trying to reset the whole game world, and then like a political trial, and like a test for her to like stop the city from murdering everybody during a rebellion. I was like, there's just so many plots and so many just like weird twists and like shifts of focus for the story that it was super hard to stay interested in it, to be honest, and to even finish it. The game mechanics, while consistently in the game, they don't have a lot of depth. Like they're there and they're a little innovative. Instead of like experience points, they collect experience orbs. So something like you would get from like Diablo. But those orbs convey rank in the real world and get them in the game, but they don't really have any impact on the gameplay. So like the difference between like a lord and the main character isn't really described really well. Like there's like most of the advancement in the story, and the main character doesn't really advance herself. Instead, she just collects orbs. She doesn't change rank. That's a technicality of the game system. Most of the power increases come from like weapons that are kind of purchased or looted from like dead enemies, or like the main characters can spend these experience orbs on like purchasing powers from a store that are like slottable. And but that's kind of it. And besides like there being a health bar, that's all there is to the game stuff. Literally that's it. So not particularly in depth. Overall, it was a disappointing read after a really good start. And I think part of the disappointment is like, it was a really good beginning and the rest of it just like, oh, that sucks. And again, it's mostly due to the unfocused nature of the plot. It just couldn't seem to stick to one storyline or purpose, and it just kept shifting around. I'm like, okay, when is this going to end at some point? So for me, like I said, the beginning is good enough to not give it a bad score, but it just wasn't entertaining. So it gets a score of 5 out of 10. The grind with the score of 5 out of 10. There we go. That's it. We are done. Okay. That's it for it, everybody. Thank you very much for listening, for watching, and thank you authors. There are 2 authors who were nice enough to write responses into the podcast for the review that they saw. I'm always happy to read those responses. I think it's only responsible to give the authors an opportunity to say something back if they choose to. So those, like I said, those authors are very nice about their responses. Though they weren't mean. They were just like, oh, you might have missed these points. Thank you very much for giving us a review, though, for giving my book a review. So they are generally nice guys. If you want to follow us, you can follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, on Patreon. And if you want to support the podcast in any way, shape, or form, you can find out all the ways to do so at litrpgpodcast.com/support. There you go. Thank you very much for hanging out with me, for listening to me go on about LitRPG and the things that I love about it. It's a passion podcast. I do this because I love it and because I know you guys as a community love the genre as much as I do. So thanks for hanging out with me. And until we can hang out again, folks, remember to go read some, and don't forget, go into those contests, man. Win some prizes. Help me to celebrate the 100th episode of this podcast. But until we can see you again, go have a good week and read some LitRPG.